Hi everyone, I'm Nick Smart, the Chief Intelligence Officer for Crystal Intelligence. I'm joined here today by my colleague Rajat Ahlawat.
Hi, I'm Rajat Ahlawat. I'm the APAC Research Lead for Crystal Intelligence.
So today we're going to be discussing the CoinDCX hack, which is one of India's largest cryptocurrency exchanges. CoinDCX suffered a financial loss because of a hack earlier in July. I think the 18th of July was the date of the attack. Ironically, or perhaps coincidentally, 1 year, 1 day after WazirX, one of the other large Indian exchanges, had a similar kind of fate. There's lots of discussion about how the attack happened, similarities between both attackers. In the case of CoinDCX, there was not a public acknowledgement of that until it was perhaps outed by various on chain open source influencers who have put out statements saying that they've lost a significant amount of funds. On the contrary, WazirX also had an attack which was a lot more public, issued various statements about the attacks. However, how it actually took place hasn't been discussed perhaps as transparently as CoinDCX. So we have two different ways of approaching the management of this particular crisis and the information around it. What do you think is the reason that's driving these particular attacks against South Asian exchanges?
One of the major things I think, like apart from the opportunity, is also a lack of regulatory environment in these countries. So Pakistan for the longest time had no regulations, but just in the last couple of months, they just revamped the whole thing. They developed a new regulatory authority. They passed laws for regulation and licensing of crypto exchanges and crypto assets. Whereas in India, it's still a gap area at this point. In India, crypto profits are taxed at around 30% and there's no loss offset. But apart from taxation, India, I think last year extended the prevention of money laundering activities law to cover crypto assets and crypto exchanges as well. The exchanges are mandated to register with the Indian Financial Intelligence Unit. But apart from that, there's no like dedicated legislation governing use of crypto assets, classification of them, and also there's no licensing framework at this point.
So an attack takes place, capability, opportunity, and intent, right? So the attackers had clearly the capability technically to pull off these cases, even with like relatively decent levels of security at both services, right? In terms of their custodial solutions, they would follow all the processes that we would definitely recommend, multi-signatures and whatever else. Whereas the actors have discovered a bypass mechanism, which they've been able to exploit successfully. But when there is either no or light touch regulation, it does open the door for these kind of actors. And I think they aren't necessarily doing anything wrong on the provider's side, but it means they don't get the same levels of support, perhaps, or protection from the state which they're regulated in. One of the other things that struck me about this case was how they responded to the attacks. So maybe, Rajat, let's just look at WazirX first. How did WazirX respond to that case, and where are they now? What's happening?
The response in both the hacks has been like really poles apart. But also part of the reason is that CoinDCX lost access to like one of its operational wallets, which was around $44 million worth of hack. Whereas WazirX had around 42 to 45% of assets compromised in that hack. It was around $35 million. So that's like one of the major differences between the two. But for CoinDCX, they agreed to cover all the losses on their side versus what WazirX did was it proceeded with basically first freezing all kinds of activities on the platform. They opened it the very next day with the crypto asset prices were lower compared to the market in general, so like 15% lower, which made many people give some additional money, just like send additional money to WazirX just to buy assets cheaper. Later on, they basically froze all the assets and they sort of had this program of socialized loss, both crypto and fiat. So, given the hack was for approximately 45% of the total funds, WazirX froze 45% of the assets for all the users, like both crypto and fiat. They're still frozen. They are undergoing moratorium based on Singapore court. The exchange's response that there have been serious allegations against them that they haven't published a live proof of reserves. And in terms of the restructuring as well, there are significant gaps on it. But at the same time, their social media response has been quite evasive as well. That includes blocking of user accounts which were asking too many questions about the hacks and also allegations that they are heavily paying social media influencers just to get some positive PR going for them.
And one of the things that perhaps we've not talked about, I think, to pull in another giant hack that happened this year, we talk about Bybit, right, and the amount of money, and everyone discusses their response strategy from a
Mhm.
communications and an industry response as being like perhaps one of the better standards in terms of this. What strikes me as interesting is long term, what does the response look like? Perhaps their long term response wasn't as good as their initial response. Like when the hack happened, I remember it was published quite openly. They were very quick to try and get a forensics report out there to talk about the attack vectors or what might have happened. One thing you've mentioned, though, is the idea of trying to manipulate the PR space and trying to do some sort of media manipulation to try and make themselves look better. Obviously, at the moment, they're allegations. How credible are these allegations?
I would say they are quite credible in that way because also when we see the exchanges response in general, how they have been dealing with the matters, for example, keeping aside money like from their basically free frozen user funds, they have been changing responses. Like first they started with 45% was hacked, then the court affidavit submitted in Singapore, which basically detailed it was around 42% rather than 45% of the funds. And if you're talking about 500 million, like 5% makes quite a lot of difference. Apart from that, the main entity behind WazirX is Zenmai Labs. 99% of Zenmai Labs is owned by Zetai Private Limited, which is a Singapore-based entity, and 1% of Zenmai is owned by the founder, Nishchal. And from the Zetai, which is a Singapore entity. That's why the court moratorium was in Singapore because they said the exchange is actually owned by Singapore entity rather than the Indian entity, which
Mhm.
also like limited the response from Indian courts in that matter because there was this time when WazirX introduced a new entity called Zensui, which is basically registered in Panama, and they said the assets are actually owned by the Panama-based entity rather than the Indian or the Singapore entity. And this is where the court rejected the first appellate moratorium and like the first restructuring application, basically alleging that WazirX is hiding facts from them.
It's tricky to try and talk about this case because we don't know what the motivations behind those particular activities were. There may be specific business reasons that we're not privy to, but certainly from the outsider's perspective, it seems evasive. But again, we don't know what's going on. I think the long-term impact of hacks is what we're talking about here. Like WazirX is a year on now. In terms of recovered funds, there hasn't been very much. I think it's also interesting too is that the people who've been able to release funds, the Indian police and the people who had liquidity through WazirX, have basically been able to get the funds out of the platform, but it really makes it difficult for the retail users. How would you think that's affected the trust of crypto platforms inside India generally? Has it had an impact on adoption or people buying and exchanging cryptocurrency? Or is it, again, just a narrow group of users who are very upset about it? Because WazirX wasn't small, right? It had lots of active users daily, like fairly large amount of funds under management. How's the impact been on the broader community in terms of trust and assets? Or even so, how's it been picked up by regulators? Are they also pointing to this as an example of why you can't trust crypto companies?
Yeah, it's actually a bit of both. So, one thing which is important to note here is Indian crypto exchanges don't allow crypto withdrawals, and that's by regulation, by the orders of the Indian FIU, where all the exchanges are registered. So, basically, all the users have the option is, let's say, deposit fiat and then do any sort of trading, like buying and selling of crypto assets, and then they can only sell the assets back and withdraw fiat. They cannot withdraw any crypto from Indian exchanges. So that way, the custodial ownership is the only option that's left with them. Like self custody is not really an option to do in India. Like with the hack and also with 45% of user assets frozen, that has given a significant drawback. That has been a major bump for Indian users. There's a lack of trust at this point because if exchanges are hacked, it's the user funds that are frozen. There is a restructuring plan in place, but that has been going on for quite some time. And also, because the user base is not organized and the Indian class action lawsuit was rejected, Indian users don't see any way out in case of a hack like this. So, while they're saying they are trying to return around 90% of the frozen assets based on 21st of January 2025, if you see the real price of the tokens later on, it's like instead of 85-90%, it's close to let's say 50-60% like that. Basically, users are paying from their own pocket for the exchange hack. India has been one of thriving countries in terms of crypto adoption, but there's a mix like a 30% tax on crypto profits, no loss offset. Basically, it's a big restriction in development of crypto sector in India, and combined with a hack like this where user funds are just frozen, combine these two things, and yeah, Indian users are slowly going away from crypto in that way.
Another thing I'd like to pick up on then is what lessons were learned from Bybit's response. And we can see some of them in CoinDCX, like India's largest ever bounty program. So like $11 million worth of recovered funds can be given to a user if they help to pursue that sort of stuff. So clearly there's been some sort of maturing in the industry of how services respond to hacks, like what they can do publicly. But there's other parts where perhaps they're falling short. And CoinDCX, one of the ones that struck me was they didn't publicly acknowledge the hack until much, much later. I'm not even sure if they have actually. What's gone well from them? What have they learned from? And what's like the other lessons perhaps that other exchanges you might want to give them as takeaways?
With the WazirX hack, this was the first case of its kind in India. They didn't have any like set processes in place. When they acknowledged the hack, they tried to do the best they could. They went to the cyber emergency response team. They did the police complaints, but also like it was kind of figuring out at that point. So, for example, the bounty program, the first was issued by WazirX, was around 5% of the stolen tokens plus $10,000, not at par with industry standards. At that point, it was seen like they are just trying to deflect it or they are not serious about the recovery. So they gradually increased the bounty program after that. But in terms of CoinDCX, they just started off like, oh, we are going to give 25% of the recovered funds, which was seen as way
Yeah.
better response. And also, like after that, they have been quite transparent. So the CEO of CoinDCX would come out with a tweet detailing how it was hacked. They have been cooperating with the police. The employee was arrested immediately a day after the hack.
I think that's another key point actually. So Wazirex, I think, was the first major one of its kind because BNS got hacked in
Mhm.
2022. And again, similar kind of thing where they didn't disclose data and
Yeah.
it was relied on someone to publish on Twitter, hey, you guys had a hack and you haven't disclosed it. There are like multiple missed opportunities, at least from the regulator's perspective, to how can we support these guys? And I think a lot of it comes down to the politics just generally about the topic. But it clearly seems to be three big exchanges, three big hacks. I wouldn't say as a geography that's a specifically high thing, but certainly it's statistically high given there aren't that many big exchanges that are domestic in India generally, especially given the size of the potential market there. I think I want to talk a bit more about the people behind this. FBI, in a joint statement with some other law enforcement agencies, have attributed WazirX to DPRK. We have a relative degree of confidence given the attack typology and the on-chain patterns that CoinDCX might have been the same people, or at least a group linked to the same state actor, Lazarus. There's been lots of discussion about the infrastructure that supports the attackers and where the money actually flows to. Do you have any insights on where that money might be going?
In both the hacks, we see kind of a similar pattern. They use Tornado Cash and other mixers to sort of mix like clean and dirty funds, after which the funds go to quite sophisticated and established money laundering operations where they're obscurated and it's quite hidden, but it's not impossible. We are currently like still working on where the funds are flowing.
What I think is quite key here is that what's most important in any crypto tracing activity is the conversion layer, which is where the money has been stolen in a cryptocurrency asset. It's the end point. Like, how does that get converted back into an asset that is more readily usable for the attacker? In the case of this particular hack, if indeed all of the hacks are attributable to group Lazarus working on behalf of the North Korean government, how does that then get realized into payments for Rocket Place? And as you alluded to, like this is definitely the biggest challenge in the space, I think, is trying to understand where the funds end up. As you said, there are some technical measures inside, but there is an equally sophisticated and well established money laundering network which underpins and supports that. And trying to penetrate and understand that is definitely something that requires a lot of energy, effort, but also something that we're working actively to try and get to the bottom of. I think to sort of like just cap all this off, then, the things that stood out to me is the lack of regulation can increase the chances of a service or even an individual becoming a target for criminals. Where there is an absence of law to protect the consumers or to force services to behave in a certain way, that is an opportunity for an attacker, and we believe it's part of their target selection process. I think many of them are opportunistic, like they look for services. If they think they can do it, they'll go ahead and run with it. But as a bigger problem, they will also seek places where there's less consequence for them. But in this case, these are just sitting ducks, basically, because what are you going to do? The government doesn't see the point in it. It's made it illegal. We don't need capacity or resources to investigate any of this stuff because it's not our problem. You shouldn't be doing it anyway. But if a domestic service wipes out over $100 million from your citizens, like maybe you want to take a look at that. And certainly as these services get bigger and bigger, there needs to be some sort of consolidation of that. The second thing then I think you talked about really nicely was the criticality of incident response and crisis management. And it's not just a technical problem. It's one where you deal with communication. It's one where you deal with the tracing and investigation side. There's a whole load of facets inside that problem which need to be tackled by anybody who's operating a business in cryptocurrency. You need to know what to do. That first 4 hours is crucial and critical, not just for your ability to trace and perhaps improve the chances of recovering funds, but also for like maintaining confidence from your investors, your users, if you've got insurers and things like that too. And then the final one we talked about was the money laundering chain. And again, it's been a year on since WazirX, maybe 20, 30 days for CoinDCX. The money laundering process is still ongoing. It takes time to take any amount of money out. North Korea have had a bit of a bounty with Bybit. It's not an easy task to launder over $1.5 billion from all these different attacks. It's not something you can just walk down to like your local bank and make a deposit. It takes a lot of time and energy and effort. And that does give us opportunities to understand the networks and systems that support it. But that's the area where we need to understand, and work really needs to be done at a critical stage, because their ability to convert it is perhaps what creates the biggest risk in this sector, right? If you can steal cryptocurrency, there's no way you can take it, then there's no point in stealing it. You've de-incentivized that. We just need to make sure we're finding as many of those places where you can take it, and doing what we can to leverage regulation or enforcement or things that are needed to try and catch those guys out. Is there anything else you would sort of want to highlight about CoinDCX? I think in terms of their incident, there's a lot of stuff about the individual who granted access. What's the story there? What happened?
Yeah, basically what happened with CoinDCX was that it's what was a major operational security disaster. One of their employees was basically taking freelance jobs from around the world. And in this specific instance, he got contacted on like Telegram or WhatsApp. He got a freelance job from a German number for around 15,000 euros. And basically, the employee would just use the company laptop for all this freelance work. And during this specific freelance job, it was this time when the malware was installed on his laptop. And that malware actually led to the compromise of the operational wallet. CoinDCS, like in that way, has been quite cooperative. The employee was arrested the next day, and basically the police tried to sort of uncovered what happened. So it also came in the news. So in that sense, CoinDCX has been quite transparent about how the hack actually happened.
And I think like this is what's interesting, right? Is that WazirX were transparent about losing the money early on, as CoinDCX wasn't. But WazirX have talked about the incident, but they haven't talked about that level of detail of CoinDCX. And they certainly didn't do it as fast as CoinDCX, because it became a fight between them and the custodian about who was to blame for this. And then on the other side, we've got CoinDCX, which, as I said, they haven't really talked about the loss to begin with. They were prompted to, and then they've been
Yeah.
really detailed about what went wrong. What we really want is all of it. This is really useful information for the regulators to understand and make better policies, and for other exchanges to take action. And this kind of like social engineering trick, right? This idea of recruiting someone from remote work. And this is another thing just to be aware of, like in this space, is the attackers have worked out a system, and we all need to be vigilant in how this operates, and like, keep on top of those security bulletins and briefs and understand what's going on. What would you offer as a defense against that, Rajat? How would you sort of like educate your staff to watch out for those kind of things? What things would you look for?
I think like there's a two-part answer to that. So number one is having your staff adequately trained. Usually in India, you just have one job. It's not usual to have like a permanent job and also take a freelance work. But also at the same time, if they are doing it, your staff needs to be trained on cybersecurity and operational security, understand how basic scams and like this malware, phishing attacks, how they work. I'm sure CoinDCX would have done that, like having rigorous training. Like if you're doing something like that, use a different laptop and not a company laptop, because you have access to sensitive company information on your personal laptop, which could be compromised. Number two, I think in the event of such a hack is the communication. The response from the exchanges matters a lot. Time is of essence in any such investigation. So all open communication from the exchange is what's gonna be best for pretty much everybody, including the exchange itself. You
Yeah.
can be hacked, but I think your reputation also depends on how transparent you are about these things. I think that's gonna be way better for your reputation in the long run rather than just trying to hide the hack, because with on-chain, it's gonna come out.
Rajat, that's wonderful. And I think there's two notes I made about that there, which I think were really important for people to take away from this, which is, first of all, is you need to change the mindset in your staff to it won't happen to me. That needs to be it could happen to me. And they often say in security, it's not if, but when. And I think it's a bit pessimistic, but it's a good approach to take the problems, to be prepared for that. And the second part, and I think this is the critical aspect too, is it's an old phrase, but like trust takes a lifetime to build, but can disappear in an instant. And your ability to react to an event, not just from a technical side, right? Like you've locked everything down, all the assets are fine, you pulled the plug on the server, whatever you needed to do to sort of control the breach, everything's great. The reality is you still have customers and users, and you still have regulators. And in particular, in the case of CoinDCX and WazirX, you have fairly hostile regulators to a certain extent, right? They're not making your life easy, and they're not necessarily all being cooperative. You're not going to help your case if you fumble a bit in the first 4 hours. You need to be able to demonstrate to them, the best foot forward. And I think the hope from this recording that you guys can take away is that there's lots of opportunities to improve and get better. There's also a wealth of knowledge across the industry. If you want more support with understanding these issues, you can talk to us directly. Get in contact with Crystal. We can discuss, what we think goes into that kind of stuff too. And more importantly too is like testing your response plans. How often do you test technically? You do a pen test, you test your disaster recovery plan. When was the last time you tested your communications plan? And really that allows you to provide the best possible response to an incident.
Just to extend to what you said, Nick, I think we also need to remove this sort of taboo around cybercrime. So, like you are a victim of a crime, like for example, a road accident or a robbery, you are a victim of it. In the same way, you are a victim of cybercrime. It could be a scam, it could be a hack, but in the end, you are the victim.
Yeah, I agree with you. And also, it's the idea of, at least with cybercrime, people think that you can help yourself better. There's a lot of finger pointing about what goes on. And the reality is that your adversary only has to be one level above what you are. And even if you're doing really well, there might be an adversary that's one above you. It's just the reality of existing in cyberspace. And the transparency and communication is definitely the right way to look at this. Thank you so much, Rajat. It's a fascinating and great discussion as always. It's nice also to talk about something that's not Iran, as many of our conversations tend to be. I really look forward to talking more about this, and I hope the information that you've given here is of use to both cryptocurrency businesses, individual users, and also regulators. Again, there's lots of good knowledge and content here that we've managed to put today. Thank you so much.
I know it's always great to have these discussions just to get this kind of awareness out to the public. And yeah, thanks a lot for your time.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.